Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's MusicWise. My name is Donato Cabrera. I'm the music director of the California Symphony and the Las Vegas Philharmonic. And this week, I'm really honored to have my friend, Joseph Horowitz, on MusicWise. We first met, we'll talk about this, we first met when I was the assistant conductor of the New Jersey Symphony, and he was the curator for their winter festival. He has... the list is probably shorter of what he has not done in classical music than what he has done. He has really been such a force in our world of music, and his maybe he would disagree with this, but I consider him a provocateur. So help me welcome Joseph Horowitz. Hi, Joe.
Well, it's a pleasure to talk to you, Donato, and I will never forget our session in New Jersey when I administered my usual Dvorak quiz. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, where I played an excerpt from the American Suite and asked everybody to guess the composer. And the point of the quiz is that nobody can ever guess the composer. They always guess that it's, Gershwin or some other American. And you said Dvorak, and that was the first time anybody had ever properly guessed who had composed that music. And that sort of was the beginning of our relationship.
But I think, Joe, that that bond, of course, that was started then. But I think we both have a fascination of American music. What has it become? What hasn't it become? And how and where we find ourselves today, and in how we're just figuring out what to do next, because we've been finally forced to do so. And we've talked about this privately and publicly over the years. But Joe, give us a little bit of a background. This is a heavily packed topic, but in relationship to particularly the videos we're going to share today with Dvorak, and then eventually we'll talk about the composer Revueltas and others, how his music affected and inspired composers such as Copland. But give us a little bit of a background in terms of how you feel, what your sense is of where the precipice we were on when Dvorak was hired to come to New York City and lead this new conservatory.
I was a music critic at the New York Times in the late 1970s, and I quit because, a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that I felt betrayed and disillusioned by the concerts that I was attending. They were all the same, and I was challenged to figure out what had gone wrong with this music that I love and the manner it had been institutionalized. The simplest way to answer that question was that American music was and is still today essentially Eurocentric. We never created our own canon. So today, American orchestras mainly play European music, American opera companies mainly European. So why didn't that happen here? What happened in Russia? What happened in Germany? And this became my obsession. Why did American music remain so Eurocentric? And I've answered that question many different ways, but the most relevant way to the topic of Dvorak, which we're about to embark on, is I've answered that question by looking at the standard narrative for American classical music as it was popularized after World War I. And there are two main writers of that narrative. One is Aaron Copland and the other is Virgil Thompson, and they're both composers. They were not music historians, and they had no expertise as music historians because there were no American music historians studying American music, which already tells you about the magnitude of this problem. All American music historians were studying German music. How is that possible? And what Copland and Thompson decided as makeshift historians is there was nothing before 1920 or maybe 1915 that really mattered. So immediately, this whole Dvorak story was written off. And yet, when I began to study, the history, especially the institutional history of American music, which has never been much studied, it became obvious to me that Dvorak was, in fact, an essential figure, and that American classical music actually peaked at the turn of the 20th century. That was its highest moment. And one of the reasons is that at that moment, everybody believed that we would acquire our own repertoire. If Dvorak were alive today and discovered that American orchestras were mainly playing Dvorak or Beethoven or Brahms, he would be scratching his head and asking, what the hell happened here? What went wrong? So if we go back to Dvorak, we discover a moment full of promise where everybody's excited. We're about to find the American Beethoven. And Dvorak said, here, let me help you. You've got a tremendous amount of interesting stuff here with this Black music that you've been listening to, what we call spirituals. And also pretty interesting that you've still got an indigenous population of Native Americans. We don't have anything like that in Bohemia. Look there and look at the Black music, and you'll come up with something, I'm sure, exciting, and create your own classical music. And it never happened. So
indeed, he gave us in his music that he wrote while in the United States, he gave us a blueprint. He not only sent us in the right direction, he showed us how to do it with
isn't it amazing? I mean, and yet, if you read Virgil Thomson and Aaron Copland and Leonard Bernstein on Dvorak, all Thomson has to say is that the New World Symphony is hackneyed. Copland never mentions Dvorak. And Bernstein writes this incredible essay against the New World Symphony in which he says the Largo could as easily be Chinese music, because it's pentatonic, as Black music. But that's ludicrous.
What do you think were some of the conscious and subconscious reasons that Thompson and Copland basically whitewashed the music before 1915?
Because they were Francophile modernists, Donato. It just aesthetically, Dvorak didn't speak to them. And that part of the American musical experience that was Germanic, for them, that was, the wrong road. And they never looked. So they would say, well, Chadwick, just sounds like second-rate German music. In fact, Chadwick wrote a lot of music that sounds American, and I still think it's some of our best music. I think the Fourth String Quartet by George Chadwick, which is his answer to the Dvorak American Quartet, is one of the best. I would say my two favorite American string quartets are completely unknown: the Chadwick Fourth and the Arthur Farwell Hockel Quartet. And Jubilee by George Chadwick should be a staple of every American orchestra, by the way it quotes Camptown Races. So this is music that was either ignored or disparaged by the people who created the standard narrative of American classical music.
So you left the New York Times. You started discovering this story, and it was revealed itself to you over many years. Along the way, you became the executive director of the Brooklyn Philharmonic. And was it at this point that you started to explore this in terms of how it can be revealed, how it can be celebrated, how this story can be told?
The answer to your question is yes, and I can be more specific. I wrote a book, which called Understanding Toscanini, as an act of therapy, trying to figure out what the hell happened. And at the end of that book, I said, if there's an audience today for classical music of a refreshed kind in the United States, it's at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, because that's a remarkable place. At the time, it was certainly the prime performing arts center in the Western Hemisphere, and it was created by one guy, Harvey Lichtenstein, who took me out to lunch because he read Understanding Toscanini, and he said, can you do something with my Brooklyn Philharmonic Orchestra? We've lost over 2/3 of our subscribers over the course of 2 seasons. And I said, sure.
What year was this? Approximately when was this?
1990s.
Okay.
1990s. I said, sure, if you let me do what I want. And he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to turn it into a humanities institution, just like a museum, where we pursue topics of interest that are thematic and create festivals. And he had nothing to lose. He said, do whatever you want. And one of the first things I did was a Dvorak festival. The reason I did the Dvorak festival is that I do something which is unknown in the world of American orchestras, which is I take my cues from scholars. And a scholar named Michael Beckerman had written an article, which I read in the journal 19th Century Music, that blew my mind. And what it said was, I've been looking at the Song of Hiawatha in the New World Symphony because even though it's long forgotten, Dvorak once said that the middle movements of his symphony were inspired by the Song of Hiawatha. And what Beckerman discovered was that the entire third movement, the scherzo, was a tone poem based on two chapters from the Song of Hiawatha, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast. Dvorak didn't intend it as a tone poem. It's just that that's what was in his head when he composed that music. We wouldn't have that music if he wasn't keying on the Dance of Palpukiwis and the Song of the Yagu and what's the other thing? On a Way, Wake Beloved. The Tale of the Yagu, sorry, and the song of the other guy who sang the song. Anyway, and Beckerman said, okay, so here it is. And you look at what he's doing and you say, holy shit, it's all there. It really is. That is what was in Dvorak's ear, in his brain, in his mind when he composed that movement. It's all there in the Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So I'll just say,
I think it's important for our viewers for those of us who aren't aware that at that time and well into the 20th century, most Americans, and I mean most,
right,
could quote
right, right.
the Song of Hiawatha.
Right. They all
in fact,
did the Song of Hiawatha. So Dvorak had like when he wrote his late tone poems, setting these Czech folk tales by what's his name? I can't forget his name. He was telling a story that the audience knew. He did the same thing in the New World Symphony, but we no longer know that story. So I did something, which is I got a guy named Peter Bogdanov, with whom I've worked ever since, to create a visual presentation for those two movements based on Beckerman's research and some thoughts of my own. And that's been used dozens of times, including by Donato Cabrera, as a visual accompaniment to the Largo and the Scherzo of the New World Symphony.
Well, what I think is so fascinating about this approach is that as orchestras are beginning now to use multimedia, to use social media, in your initial concerts and festivals at the Brooklyn Academy and with the Brooklyn Philharmonic, you sort of laid the groundwork for this idea that orchestras should and can and could be so much more than just the standard overture, standard concerto with European soloist X, followed by intermission and the same old symphonies. I think what we should do is watch the very beginning, this first clip, just to get a sense of what you're describing.
What my orchestra now is called Post Classical Ensemble. It's 18 years old. It's in DC. It's an experimental chamber orchestra. And what we're doing during the pandemic, rather than streaming concerts, is making films, which turns out to be ridiculously easy because all of our concerts and DVDs and CDs tell stories. And with the technology at hand today, I can make a movie in 2 weeks. So here's a movie we're about to excerpt called Dvorak's New World Symphony as a Lens on the American Experience of Race. And we're going to look at a segment of the movie that's pretty early on.
Great, thank you.
What we just heard is one of the best known excerpts from the entire symphonic literature, the opening of the Scherzo of Dvorak's New World Symphony. And what we just saw were verses from the Song of Hiawatha by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, because it turns out that this passage was in fact inspired by the Dance of Palpukiwis at Hiawatha's wedding. That's the reason it has a tom-tom beat. And that's the reason for the triangle, because Dvorak is hearing the sound of the bells on the moccasins of the dancing Indians. That may sound far-fetched, but it turns out that Dvorak also wrote an Indian dance in his American suite, and it also has a triangle for the same reason. So I'm referring to one of the strangest and most fascinating stories in the entire history of Western music, the story of Dvorak in America. The dates are 1892 to 1895. What was he doing in New York City for those 3 years? How did he acquire an American accent so different from the Bohemian idiom of his Slavonic dances, an accent in which he's embedded the influence of African American song and the idea of Native America? What does this story tell us today at a fraught moment in the American experience? What can we learn from it? How can we answer the questions, what is America? Or who is an American? These are the topics of our film. Most of the music that we'll be listening to.
Hold on, Joe. Yeah. What were you going to say?
I said that's plenty. I mean, that puts the topic on the table.
To paint even a bigger picture, talk about how I think it's really even hard to you show the cover of the New York Times as this is what I'm going to ask about. That premiere of the New World Symphony, the review of that concert was on the front page of the New York Times, was it not?
I doubt it, but the reviews were enormously long, and the best of those reviews, which was by W.J. Henderson in the New York Times, was over 2,000 words, and it's still one of the best things ever written about the New World Symphony. I doubt that it was on page one.
Maybe it was on the cover. It was, but it was a prominent and
it was over 2,000 words. I mean, you'd never see a concert review of that length today.
And the other thing I remember you've talked about in regard to this review is that it's, and this has something else that we should talk about perhaps, and that has occurred during the 20th century. It wasn't about the conductor. It wasn't about the performance per se. It was about it was about the music. It was a review of the music.
It didn't even mention the other two works in the program, and it did not mention the conductor or the performance. It was just about the new works.
And I think that this, and you've written about this as well, that the cult of the conductor, the cult of the performer, took away. This is one of the many things during the 20th century that veered ourselves away from the actual topic at hand when coming to a concert, which is will still come to concerts. They really don't come to see the orchestra play, or they don't necessarily come to see the conductor. They really come because they want to hear something. They want to be transported in whatever way by the music they're experiencing.
Yeah, it was a different moment than Otto. It's really hard to believe. I'll restate it because I can hardly believe it myself, but I've read that review any number of times. It never mentions the name of the orchestra. It never mentions the name of the conductor. It doesn't tell you that the Brahms Violin Concerto and the overture to Mendelssohn's Midsummer Night's Dream were played on the same concert. You won't find it. And by the way, everybody who read that review knew that it was New York Philharmonic and Anton Seidl because there had been over a dozen articles already about the impending premiere of the New World Symphony. So it actually was superfluous information.
Talk about the dichotomy of, and this goes a little bit into explaining perhaps some of the social aspects of why Dvorak's music wasn't accepted. Talk a little bit about the dichotomy of the review that happened of the New York Times, of the performance in New York versus the subsequent performance in Boston.
Yeah, this story about Dvorak has so many twists and turns that strain credulity. And there's nothing about this story more hard to believe than what happened a few days later when the New World Symphony was premiered by the Boston Symphony, and Dvorak was denounced as a Negrophile. I'm conflating two things here because that Hale, Philip Hale, when he called Dvorak a Negrophile, was actually reviewing Chadwick's Fourth String Quartet, which I mentioned before, and saying, "Too bad. Look what's happened to George Chadwick. Terrible. He's now being influenced by the Negrophile Dvorak." But Chadwick was already there when he reviewed the New World Symphony because he viewed Dvorak essentially as a barbarian. All of the Boston critics bought this idea of racial hierarchy, which you do not find in the New York reviews at all, where the Anglo-Saxons are at the top and then come the Slavs. And of course, down at the bottom somewhere are the black people and the red people. That was the Boston mindset, hearing the New World Symphony and feeling threatened and estranged. Whereas in New York, everybody bought it. They thought, wow, yeah, Black Americans, Native Americans. There was a very progressive strain of thought in 1893 about race in New York City. Don't think that those people, were stupider or less sophisticated than we are. They were smarter and more sophisticated than we are.
This is a slightly off topic, but it's stuck in my mind ever since we talked about it, and it's going back just a little bit to just some very disarming facts of American music and American composers that we sort of take for granted now, but not for too long. This has been the case. Give us a little bit of a history lesson, Joe, if you mind, about Gershwin's music. Just slightly off topic, it's so fascinating. When Rhapsody in Blue was first performed on a subscription concert, we talked about this recently.
Well, this is another thing, when you write a history about something that nobody's ever looked at, the mind boggles. And when I was writing my history of classical music in America, I was stunned to discover that all the guys who liked Gershwin were foreign born. In classical music, if you were an American musician and you were born in the US, you didn't like Gershwin because he was a threat. But even in this country, there are a lot of people who did. Heifetz liked him, Otto Klemperer liked him, Charles Martin Leffler liked him, Fritz Reiner liked him. Arnold Schoenberg said, great composer. He was a personal friend of his. So what do all these people have in common? They're all born over there. And as a result, this music was stigmatized and marginalized as pops music. I undertook to contact about a dozen orchestras, and I asked them three questions. When did you first perform Rhapsody in Blue on subscription? When did you first perform the Concerto in F on subscription? And when did you first perform American in Paris on subscription? And the answers were mind-boggling. Generally, it was around the year 2000. In Boston, it was a little later. In Chicago, it was a little earlier. And I mean a little earlier, I mean in the 1990s, right? That's when these orchestras first performed these pieces on subscription by George Gershwin.
This does tie in a little bit to this sort of stigma.
Absolutely, to Dvorak. I mean, progeny of Dvorak, George Gershwin.
Absolutely. The second clip, Joe, goes a little bit deeper. I think it's important to recognize that this movie that let's face it, you guys, the post-classical ensemble, have the content in order to produce these movies. Most orchestras do not.
No orchestra does. I mean, the fact is, if you look at what we produce for Naxos, we have a DVD about the New Deal documentaries, The Cloud That Broke the Plains and The River, which we present them with a new soundtrack and commentary. We have a DVD on Redes, which we'll talk about later. We have a CD called Dvorak in America.
Mm-hmm.
The CD we're producing this week, it's coming out this week, on Bernard Herrmann with a 1942 radio play, 44, Whitman, we will also turn into a movie, which will be streamed this week. So yeah, all of this stuff is actually, that's what I realized at our fingertips. We can make movies in 2 weeks.
After the Brooklyn Philharmonic, tell us a little bit how Music Unwound, and that's how the Las Vegas Philharmonic and the New Hampshire Music Festival and other places I've been affiliated, we came to perform these incredible projects. Tell us how Music Unwound was created and how it existed.
When I ran the Brooklyn Philharmonic, we became the first orchestra to get a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We got 2 huge grants from them. And to this day, I think the only other orchestra that's ever gotten an NEH grant is the American Symphony, because we were a humanities institution. So we were eligible for a humanities grant, which is to say we did contextualization that was thematic and cross-disciplinary. And this is my calling card. And I was doing these festivals for the Pacific Symphony. And I'm thankful to a guy named Gary Good, who was their development director, who said, "Why don't we apply for an NEH grant?" And I said, "Are you kidding? Do you know how labor intensive it is to apply for an NEH grant? That's the most labor intensive application that you can undertake." And I know from bitter experience in Brooklyn, because I was turned down once as well as being granted twice, but it stuck. And I said, okay. So Music Unwound was born. When you do an NEH project like that, it has to be national. So I needed partners, and the Pacific Symphony was one of the original partners. The Buffalo Philharmonic was one of the original partners. North Carolina Symphony. I can't remember all the Louisville Orchestra. These are all places where I knew people who would take an interest. And it was funded. It was called Music Unwound. It was funded 3 times for $1 million. Eventually, it included your New Hampshire Music Festival and your Las Vegas Philharmonic. And of all those programs, there were 4 of them: a Kurt Weill program, a Dvorak program, an Ives program, and a Mexican program. The one I did the most and the most popular, of course, was Dvorak in America. When we did it in Las Vegas, somebody came up to me afterwards and said, "That's the best concert I've ever attended." And that was not an unusual response. And then the NEH acquired new leadership under a nameless president, and Music Unwound was not refunded, and it no longer exists. But that was Music Unwound.
This afforded you the ability, though, to refine these programs. So, over the course of the years, and in creating the 4 programs, what was it that you found worked, and what was it that you thought was really effective?
Well, The Sleeper turned out to be Weill. Weill's story is a story of immigration. And what worked was El Paso and South Dakota, because of what I encountered on the ground. Our friend Delta David Geyer at the South Dakota Symphony has created an unparalleled, to use the jargon, outreach capacity to Indian reservations. So here I was presented with an incredible opportunity to take the Dvorak story to Native America, and we did. And that's to say that that's an orchestra that's got very deep connections with the community, with schools. And the other place was El Paso, where a guy named Frank Candelaria, now the dean of the Blair School of Music at Vanderbilt, was the associate provost of the University of Texas, El Paso, an amazing institution, the most inspirational university environment I've ever encountered because of the hunger of the students. And in some ways, there's something like that in Las Vegas, in the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, somewhat reminiscent. So Frank was a genius at flogging everybody into line. Different disciplines, different teachers, different classrooms. So he would agglomerate all of these students and all of these classes and all these classrooms around Kurt Weill in America or the Mexican Revolution or Dvorak in America. We got a guy named Brian Yothers, who was in our film, who's a a Melville scholar, to talk about Longfellow. And that, you asked me, what's a big success? Brian Yothers was a huge success because here I had somebody who could actually tell us about who Longfellow was, why that poem was so popular, and he could deflect ignorance. Oh, Longfellow, he was some kind of a appropriator who turns out he was a huge abolitionist and a great supporter of Native Americans. And Native Americans actually took to the Song of Hiawatha. So Brian actually knows these things. And I could go into a classroom with him at the University of Texas at El Paso, and we would do a joint presentation on Dvorak, one half on Longfellow, one half on Dvorak, hand out tickets, and they'd all go to the concert and attend this New World Symphony performance with the visuals from the Song of Hiawatha. That was a home run. And it was
This is actually and I'm not quite sure if you probably have the answer to this, but a member of our orchestra here Omar asks, I'm curious if Dvorak's setting of the Longfellow poem might have had any influence on Samuel Coleridge Taylor's Song of Hiawatha. Do you know if there's any connection?
The answer is no, but Coleridge Taylor regarded Dvorak as an inspiration. And some of his music sounds a lot like Dvorak. And I would particularly mention that he has a piece for violin and orchestra setting the spiritual "Keep Me From Sinking Down." That sounds an awful lot like that Dvorak romance for violin and orchestra. So in that piece, you hear a conflation of Coleridge Taylor, who's a Victorian British Black composer, Dvorak, and Black America. But if you listen to his most famous work, which is the Wedding Feast of Hiawatha, it just sounds British. It really doesn't sound like Dvorak or the New World Symphony at all.
The next clip you have is talking about conflation and elision.
Yeah.
This is such a wonderful, again, seeing the movie reminds me of so much of how powerful this is in the concert hall, because if you haven't seen one of these, if you hadn't been a part of one of these Music Unwound concerts, if you as an audience member, you would walk in, of course, and you'd see a large movie screen above the orchestra, and Peter's visualizations really play such an important part to from the audience experience.
So here we have two different things. This should be distinguished. There is the visual presentation for the Largo and the Scherzo. There's also a thing called the Hiawatha Melodrama, which has its own visual presentation, and that's what we're going to see. Beckerman and I created a 35-minute melodrama, which is to say a work for narrator and orchestra, with music by Dvorak and words by Longfellow. When Dvorak said, I was inspired by the death of Minnehaha when I wrote the Largo, Mike Beckerman said, there's only one possible place in the Largo that could evoke the death of Minnehaha. It's the wonderful section in C sharp minor. And so I then took the section in C sharp minor and slapped some Longfellow on top of it as the movement from the Hiawatha Melodrama, which I called The Death of Minnehaha. And then Peter, for this film, really for the first time, created a visual track for that. And that is what we're about to see, I think.
Yes. Thanks, Maggie. I think it's so interesting, seeing this from, I'm usually I have the worst seat in the house, or the worst place in the house to see incredible work that the eye that he brings, and his ability to capture the imagery, just so.
So let's give some credit where credit is due.
Yes.
It's Kevin Days as the narrator. That was Angel Ordonez beautifully conducting the post-classical ensemble. I'm the one who insisted on the slow tempo for the cadence, having composed the cadence. But I'm particularly pleased with the way I started this movement, which is not with the New World Symphony, but with my favorite passage from Dvorak's American Suite, composed in 1894, which is also in C-sharp minor, and is some of the most desolate music in this Indian mode of Dvorak that he ever composed. So I wanted that music. In fact, I returned to that theme at the end of the melodrama when Hiawatha sails into the purple mists of evening. I bring back this theme, which is a favorite of mine from the American Suite. So it's my idea to elide this C-sharp minor passage as a kind of preface midway through the Hiawatha melodrama to the C-sharp minor passage in the Largo. Peter's application here of visuals, like that canoe when he cans into the canoe, that's really great stuff.
Really is.
It's really, really remarkable.
Before we go on to the next excerpt, tell us a little bit about the two folks that Dvorak met, befriended, taught in New York, that sort of revealed to him parts of America and parts of American music and culture that he would never have experienced otherwise. And in that, I mean the young Czech violinist who invited him to Spillville, and of course Burley.
So Kovarczyk and Burley. Burley, imagine that Dvorak, who needed an assistant, chose a black assistant. That tells you a lot about Dvorak. I think partly he was a man of enormous empathy, but he also knew that he could use this young 23-year-old black fellow who so beautifully sang the spirituals he was taught by his blind grandfather, a former slave, and they bonded. Burley revered the memory of Dvorak the rest of his life, and Burley is the man most responsible for turning spirituals into concert songs. If you listen to Marian Anderson and Paul Robeson sing Deep River, that is Deep River, composed by Dvorak's assistant, Harry Burley, in 1913. Kovarczyk I know much less about, other than that he had a family in Spillville, Iowa. Have you been to Spillville, Donato?
I have. I think I'm one of the few people that I made it a point to visit Spillville.
Yeah, so did I.
You know, there are less people. I'm sure you've been as well,
Yeah.
and there are less people that live there now than lived there when Dvorak spent the summer. And I found out just recently, though, that unfortunately that fantastic Bohemian restaurant that was in what was basically just the main street of 3 or 4 buildings. There was a great Bohemian restaurant that I've had lunch that served Pilsner or Quell on tap. That has since closed, but it's still, if you go to the cemetery, it's still a Czech cemetery with the wrought. I think it's aluminum, perhaps. I can't remember what metal is used to make those beautifully ornate headstones, and the organ that's in the loft is still the same organ that Dvorak would play every morning.
The church, I found it very moving to be in the church that you just referred to. And Dvorak, as you just said, would play the organ every morning. It's highly, highly evocative. And so Kovarczyk's family was there, and he went there for the summer and decided he liked it so much he might just settle there in retirement, which he did not do, but he went back again with his own family. It was a Czech settlement, and he felt right at home. It's really beautiful there too.
Well, it is, and that lovely the Turkey River, which is
Yeah,
more of a stream than a
yeah,
river
yeah.
that flows the town. You imagine Dvorak sitting by the banks of the Turkey River and
Yeah. Drinking
composing
beer.
his drinking beer
Yeah,
and composing his string, the American String Quartet, and it's still a very evocative place.
it is.
A very American place, but at the same time, well, a very classically American place in that it is an immigrant settlement, and that's the story of America.
Yes, and of course the Dvorak story of America. It keys on three things: Native Americans, African Americans, and the landscape of the American West, which he found both desolate and majestic. So that's his picture of America. So, and that's a pretty telling picture. It's a very usable picture to this day, and it's not a happy picture. He knew what had happened to Black Americans, and he anticipated, probably, as most people did in the 1890s, that Native Americans would be exterminated. So there's a lot of pathos, a lot of sadness in Dvorak's America and in his New World Symphony.
I'm happy to play the next clip, but on the other hand, I do want to spend a time on the
Yeah, do
next film.
Yeah.
Let's move forward, because this is an equally compelling story that I think would certainly resonated here in Las Vegas and still resonates to this day, and especially the southwest United States, which was Mexico for a very long time, and Spanish is still a very important language in this part of the country. Tell us a little bit about what was happening in Mexico in the early part of the 20th century, artistically, culturally, politically, that was so fertile, and so much so that it inspired what many Americans consider our one of our greatest composers, Aaron Copland, to change his compositional course entirely, and begin writing the music that we all know him for now.
Well, the first thing that happened in Mexico was a revolution. And the outcome of the revolution was incomplete. When you get to the 30s, you have a generation of artists who are unhappy that the revolution didn't go further in reallocating land and healing class and social divisions. And this is maybe the most important manifestation of political art in the history of the Western Hemisphere. I just made that up, but I do believe that the most formidable political composer of concert music in our hemisphere by far is Silvestre Revueltas, who with Chavez is one of the two famous composers in Mexico in the 30s. But mainly we think of the muralists. We mainly think of three guys: Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, and Orozco. Um, we have that's a different topic, but it's a fascinating topic. And of course, there's Frida Kahlo, who is Rivera's wife. There's never anything like this in the United States. And indeed, Americans, John Steinbeck, Langston Hughes, Aaron Copland, Paul Strand, Eisenstein from Russia, all these people went to Mexico because Mexico had really figured out something we never figured out, which is how to create great political art. It's mind-boggling. And in the case of Revueltas, it's a seamless continuum from the artistic to the political. What we're about to look at, well, I guess the film introduces this topic itself. I don't have to introduce the film. Let the film introduce itself, right?
Great. Let's do that.
Let's do it. Yeah. The 4-minute film clip you're about to see seems to me one of the most remarkable examples in the history of cinema of music wedded to the moving image. A community of poor Mexican fishermen unites, storms the city where their fish are sold, at a great profit, of which they get practically nothing. Their leader has just been murdered. See what you think.
I think, Joe, it begs. I think you need to describe that scene a little bit more for folks to understand what was actually happening at that moment and the basis of this film.
This is the ending of a film about poor fishermen in the Veracruz region exploited by the market who band together and revolt. It's a film that advocates revolution and workers uniting, because the fishermen were not united until one of their leaders was murdered. And they unite and storm the bastions of power. The cinematographer is Paul Strand. The composer is Silvestre Revueltas, who we can talk about in a moment. And that is the film from 1936 with a new soundtrack recorded by a post-classical ensemble conducted by Angel Gil Ordóñez on a Naxos DVD, which we used as the basis for our film about the film, which we called Redes Lives. And the solo trumpet, who's amazing in this performance, is Chris Gecker, who's one of the best-known trumpet players in the world and is our principal trumpet. So this is something that orchestras can do with live music, and Donato, you did it twice, right? Did you do it in New Hampshire? No, you didn't do it in New Hampshire. You did it in Las Vegas.
I did it in Las Vegas. And I want to get to that concert, especially to our discussion that happened after the concert.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Before we do that, paint the scene. Why was it so influential on Copland? What was happening? There was such a successful dialogue between art and politics and culture that was happening in Mexico. What was that Copland witnessed?
So this is really the focus of our film. And all these films have Zoom chats, which are follow-up Zoom chats. And the follow-up Zoom chat for this film was called The Artist and the State. And the reason it was called The Artist and the State is that if you're an American like Copland and you go to Mexico, you're intensely envious. And Copland wrote back and he said, "Boy, am I jealous. Here in the United States, I feel completely irrelevant. And I go to Mexico and all these artists and intellectuals, they're right at the center of things. Chavez is running, well, he eventually founded the most important Mexican orchestra and ran a conservatory. At that time, he was running the Institute of Fine Arts. And people like Rivera and the other muralists, they were the most famous Mexicans and the most influential, not least in Mexico itself. They were what Stalin called engineers of the soul. They really impacted on social and political change. And this was a mind-blowing discovery for Aaron Copland, that an artist could have such a central impact on a nation.
So he returns to the United States, and the first thing he composes in this populist style is El Salón Mexico.
That's right.
And he goes on to, of course, compose pieces like Appalachian Spring, Billy the Kid. Really, the list is the pieces that we all know so well in this new style. Fanfare for the Common Man, of course. And Copland's intent was, as a populist composer, to create music by and for the people. Correct?
Yes, he called it the new audience. And he said the biggest challenge facing us today, meaning American composers, is to compose a music that speaks both to us and to them. So who's his exemplar? It's somebody like Shostakovich or Revueltas. Not that he likes their music very much, but he sees that they've succeeded amazingly. I mean, Revueltas absolutely succeeds in composing a music for us and them. He is, to my ears, a greater composer than Copland. And he did reach an enormous audience because Mexicans heard their voice in the music of Revueltas, which sounds unlike anything else. And as our film stresses, his basic instruments are the instruments that he heard in the village bandas of his youth. Trumpet, tuba, violin, not oboe, not flute, not bassoon. And Donato, he's got one of the most individual symphonic palettes of any composer of his generation. And
I couldn't agree more. I mean, if anyone watching right now would go to iTunes or YouTube and just check out his music, his music is truly unlike any other music. Yeah. It is.
What does it sound like? There's nothing you can say. Right. You can't say it sounds like X composer. Try it. Nothing comes to mind.
I think one of the most important discussions I've had in the concert hall was the discussion that we had.
It was great.
Directly following our performance
Yeah.
of this Copeland in Mexico presentation, and we had I would guess 50 to 75 people, maybe a little more. They were scattered throughout.
At least 100. Yeah, a lot of people.
Right.
Yeah.
A lot of people stayed, and this is one of the hallmarks of your of the Music Unwound concerts is that there is not a pre-concert lecture. There is a post-concert discussion where the audience is encouraged to share anything that they've experienced, and we really truly had the two opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And Joe, you can share the I think it was there was the very first comment, and they were sitting in the front row.
A woman was raising her hand, call on me, and Donato said, "Yes. What would you like to say?" And she said, "I hated it." And I thought, "Wow, great! That's phenomenal. We can talk about this until the sun comes up." And we talked for a long time.
And then
when the stage was being emptied, she came to the lip of the stage because she wanted to talk some more. And she did. That was Roberto Kolb, who came from Mexico City, who's the leading authority in Revueltas, and they continued to talk.
And really, it's about engagement when it comes down to it. And that's what we want. We want people to have engagement. And then the other side of that was that spectrum was a wonderful young lady stood up and she said, I moved here from Mexico City 16 years ago, and this is the first time that any institution in this city has celebrated anything from Mexico, any art whatsoever. And I will forever remember that and be appreciative of the fact that we did this concert in Las Vegas.
We got a lot of very personal testimony, both of those programs, the Dvorak program too. The Las Vegas audience was really impressive. People were testifying.
And this is something that's so special about the Las Vegas audience is that it's really hard to find anywhere else that they're hungry for what we offer. And I think we have followed this sort of humanities inflected programming. Even when we don't do Music Unwound, the way that I like to introduce the pieces is a little bit more than just my 100 greatest hits of classical music programmed. Joe, we're a little bit over time, but I want to thank you for this. Let's
tell people where they can find the movies. Okay.
Yes, I want. Yeah, exactly.
Just go to www.postclassical.com and click on More Than Music, and all of the music. We must have at least half a dozen of them now. They're just
we'll put the link in the comment section. But is there anything else that you'd like to share in terms of where do you feel? And this could be another hour-long conversation, but how do you sense where we are right now?
My great frustration is that we still don't curate the musical past of our own country the way museums curate the artistic past of the United States, and they have scholars on staff to do that. So here, all of a sudden, we're in a moment that people are scrambling to play music by Black composers, and since we've not curated our musical past, no one knows a damn thing. They don't know about Burley, they don't know about Coleridge Taylor, they don't know about Florence Price, they don't know about William Grant Still, they don't know about Nathaniel Dett, they don't know about
William Dawson.
Excuse me, did I not say William Dawson is my favorite guy? Had we acquired a normal classical music culture, we would know our own music, and we do not. We don't even know the Dvorak American Suite or the Chadwick Fourth String Quartet. So sitting there undiscovered is, for instance, a symphony by Dawson, the Negro Folk Symphony, premiered by Stokowski in 1934, that to my ears is as impressive as any American symphony I know. And why don't we know it? Because we haven't curated our musical past. It's still not too late. And if Music Unwound had not been terminated, what we would be doing right now is a program contextualizing the Negro Folk Symphony by Dawson, which is progeny of Dvorak. So is Florence Price's quite wonderful Symphony Number 3. That's progeny both of Dvorak and Chadwick, because she studied with Chadwick, and Chadwick is an influence on her, just as Dvorak was an influence on Chadwick. Alas, orchestras don't know Chadwick, and they don't know Price, and they don't know Dawson. So now there's a kind of a panic to catch up in a very undisciplined way. I wish it would become possible for orchestras to become humanities institutions and curate the American past so that we understand ourselves better and that we better know what riches we actually possess in our unknown and forgotten repertoire.
It's a wish I share. And
I know that. But you're
thank
rare.
you.
Donato, I maybe to close by saying that, as you know, you are unusual. And there's a small group of conductors, including David Geyer, whom you know, and Untold from DC, very small, that shares your interest. More typically, somebody conducting an American orchestra is born abroad, travels a lot, and never heard of Chadwick, never heard of Dawson, and doesn't really care. So it's a harsh way to end. But the fact is, what you do and what I do remains the exception rather than the rule, unfortunately, and alas.
We're warriors. We're warriors, Joe.
Yeah, we're warriors.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Don't disconnect. But thank you, everyone, for joining MusicWise this week. See you next time.